Lady Golden Hand by Nix Whittaker. Chapter 1. The copious blood running along the channels of the cobbled street was likely the reason for alarm amongst the locals. They crowded the entrance to the alley but didn't wander despite their curious looks. Rayne paid more attention to her partner than to the blood or the crowds. Larkin rubbed his face and asked her, "Is it human?" It surprised Rayne that the expo street runner was so squeamish. This was no worse than one of her sister's experiments. Unlike her sister's experiments, she doubted the scene was about to spew gobs of viscera in a sudden explosion. Whoever dumped the body had chopped it up into chunks no bigger than a large rat. The smaller pieces, she assumed, were dragged off by the pragmatic life forms of Brickstain. The pungent smell of the typical Londinium alley overpowered the coppery odor of freshly spilt blood. It was early in the morning, so at least there weren't any flies yet. That didn't mean the offal hadn't drawn a crowd. She eyed the bystanders with caution. 2 constables kept the bystanders back at the mouth of the alleyway, though they seemed reluctant to wander any closer to the remains. Death was not an unfamiliar sight here, but it wasn't every day someone took the time to mutilate the body afterward, so Rayne could understand the curiosity and fear. Rayne crouched down, shifting her blue wool coat aside so it wouldn't trail in the tracks of blood. The killer hadn't bothered to strip the body, and there were shreds of clothes still wrapped around the rough shapes of a human jigsaw puzzle. She rested her elbow on her knee as she leaned forward to inspect the evidence. 1 human being. 2 feet, 2 hands. No head, though, Rayne informed Larkin. When he didn't answer, she glanced up at him. His skin sported a shade of mashed peas as he looked determinedly at the crowd with steel in his spine. Rayne hid her smile. Larkin would not appreciate being mocked. The last thing she wanted to do was offend her partner. Metal glinted in the blood. Gold. Rayne shifted onto her toes and leaned over. Larkin grunted. Being bent over as she was, he wouldn't see her face, so she didn't hide her smile. He would start with a lecture soon. He always did when she did something he didn't agree with. She had her fair share of lectures throughout her life. Using her metal prosthetic hand, Rayne fished the ring out of the blood. The muted sensors in her hand made the action bearable. The sensors resulted from the technology dragons had shared with the humans. She didn't know the details, only that it involved small crystals. After growing up with a rudimentary claw, the intricate brass hand was a work of art. Wiping the blood away revealed the engraving of a dragon motif on the gold ring. Popular in wedding rings ever since the treaty had been signed and dragons started taking humans as their mates. This ring was delicate and made for a woman. Rayne frowned at the clothes surrounding the mutilated flesh. The cloth was well made, a tight weave and hard-wearing. Not something a rich woman would wear. A poorer woman would have cheaper material, a richer woman would go with a more delicate cloth. One section had a torn pocket. A small velvet bag half revealed by the damaged fabric. Perfect for a little memento like a ring. This was the clothing of a man. That was no guarantee of gender though. That thought had Rayne turning over parts of the body. Larkin protested, "My lady." Ignoring Larkin, she found what she was looking for and rose to her feet. She cleaned off her metal hand with a handkerchief pulled from a pocket in her coat. "What is it now, Larkin? A lady like you shouldn't be touching the dead." His accent grew stronger when he worried. He had picked up her own haughty tones over the years they had worked together. Though she didn't think he was ashamed of his heritage, rather he was a good mimic. "I'm hardly a lady. Certainly not after working for the Metropolitan Police Department for 2 years. Your father is a duke, that makes you a lady," he insisted. To society, it wasn't enough she was born to nobility, they had disowned her even when her father hadn't. Rayne paused in cleaning her hand and ran the handkerchief over the ring. The blood had concealed an engraving inside. Holding it up to the light of the dawn that cracked between 2 buildings, she read out loud, "To my beloved Eleanor." Lowering her hand, she said more to herself than to Larkin, "Not his then. It's a he." Larkin's mashed pea complexion had warmed marginally, so she was unlikely to have to dodge his morning meal. Rayne studied him a little closer. Today he looked a little less disheveled than usual, as his blue coat was pressed and the elbow darned where it had gone threadbare over the last few years. She doubted he would appreciate a compliment, so she stuck to the case in hand. "Yes, our victim is male. One of some wealth from his clothes, but not a nobleman. A poor man would have pawned the gold ring, and the clothes weren't made for a laborer." She flicked out another one of her handkerchiefs with her free hand and nestled the ring inside, slipping it into her pocket for safekeeping. Rayne used the soiled handkerchief to finish cleaning off her mechanical hand. Made from brass, her hand was articulated to allow movement but also to hide the gears and workings underneath. It made it difficult to get the blood out of the creases of each segment. Rayne kept flexing the fingers to make sure she hadn't missed anything. Larkin asked, "Why aren't you out doing what other ladies do?" "Ah, the lecture." She'd hoped he would forget his earlier objection. Rayne focused on the task at hand with more determination than was strictly needed. Larkin was going for an old tried-and-true tirade. He saw it as his duty to help her go back to her place in society. Every time he asked, she had a new answer for him. She hoped one day he would figure out all the reasons added up as concrete logic for her choices. Especially for why she was here as a constable rather than dancing attendance on other nobles. "I have a brain, Larkin, and I like to use it. Drinking tepid tea and eating stale cakes is not something I consider worthy of my time, or my mind." Larkin snorted. "There are other ways to use your mind. You could have become a teacher." Rayne held up her now clean metal hand. "I'd scare the little urchins witless with this." The hand was the main reason she had to forge a new path for herself in the first place. A mutilated woman wasn't accepted easily into society, and certainly not acceptable as a match for the darlings otherwise known as gentlemen. Unfortunately, the main objective of nobles was to make the right match. That future was not in her cards. Instead, she found her own path, and one she was pleased to be on. Even if it meant cleaning blood off her hand in a back alley in the greater Londinium area. Instead of continuing down this dead-end conversation, she changed the subject. "Let's ask around, and see what everyone knows." Larkin huffed but moved to interrogate the onlookers. Chapter 2. Rayne approached her workplace from the Whitehall entrance. She preferred the front entrance, which was quieter than the one which opened onto Scotland Yard. There were other constables in the office areas and others like Larkin, who were the muscle for the department, who milled around waiting for an assignment. Most had come from watchman positions or Bow Street. Now they all were Robert Peeler's vision and often called Bobbies or Peelers. As the only woman who worked there as an investigator, Rayne garnered looks from visitors. Many were speculative, but most were downright hostile. When Rayne had first come to work here 2 years ago, she had shamelessly used her connections as the daughter of a duke to bludgeon a position for herself amongst her fellow officers. Making her way to Maine's office to report back on the case he had assigned them, she ignored the tension from the others. Larkin went off to talk with the other constables. They wouldn't share tidbits about the city while she was around, so her job was to talk with one of the leaders of the Metropolitan Police while Larkin gathered gossip from the other constables. Rayne backed up when she came around the corner and ran into Fields. A solid man, he towered over her much shorter frame. His own blue uniform was immaculate. Even the brass buttons were polished so she could see her own reflection in them. He had a leather brace for his 2 guns, which were far from the standard of a single flintlock. She was also sure he had other weapons hidden from a cursory view. He narrowed his eyes as he looked down at her. She salved her pride by telling herself he would have to look down on all his officers, as he was well over 6 feet tall and loomed over her mediocre height. "Miss Ancaster. What brings you here?" Your office is on the top floor. Fields was technically her boss, though they didn't interact at all on any given day. He had Mains deal with her instead or went through Larkin. Rayne tried not to hold it against him that he had voted against her placement at the service. But he had been outranked by her godfather, Sir Charles Rowan. Fields showed his displeasure in small ways. Mostly by ignoring her. She cleared her throat. Just reporting in, sir. On that dismembered body that was reported. Human? His voice speculative. Yes, sir. Male. She clasped her hands behind her back more to stop fidgeting than to show respect. I was so sure it was a hoax. Fields waved her off. Rayne didn't wait to see if he wanted his own update on their case and dashed past him to Main's office. Mains looked up from the small desk perched in the center of the room. Filing cabinets lined the walls and obscured a single window. There were no personal items in the room. Rayne had once heard Mains state that his life was his work. The evidence was this room which Mains rarely left. Mains frowned. Ancaster. She took a deep breath to calm herself after her brush with Fields. I'm reporting in, sir. When Mains merely stared at her she added, the mutilated body found in brick stain. Enlightenment brightened his eyes. Oh yes. Was it human? He filled his pen from the inkwell ready to take notes. Yes, male, missing his head and some smaller pieces, though I assume the rats got those. The head was deliberately taken. The head would have been too heavy for the rats to scavenge. Whether it was the murderer or some opportunist who wanted a trophy was still unknown. Rayne played with the brass button on the wool coat over her uniform. It was specially made for her as she was the only woman in the force. A little flattery with the tailor had gone a long way to gaining her the uniform. Head. Interesting. Any evidence? He wiped off the end of his fountain pen when it left a splotch on the page and went back to taking notes. There was a wedding ring. She described it, including the inscription. So he was married. He might have been. Most likely a widower if the ring came to him honestly. Or he could be a thief and stole the ring. Or the ring belonged to his long-dead mother. It broke her heart to think he could have possibly been on his way to marry his sweetheart. The possibilities were endless. She didn't correct Mains as he shouldn't have made that assumption even if the victim had been wearing the ring instead of having it tucked away in a pocket. His pen scratched as it crossed the page. His notes tiny and neat. Her father's secretary would have been impressed. Most of Main's men couldn't read or write, so Mains usually kept the case notes. She had offered to write up the notes for her own cases, but Mains had his own way of keeping notes. Rayne wondered if he did not approve of her. He was partners in running the place with her godfather, and she didn't know what influence Sir Rowan had brought to bear on the barrister that Mains had accepted her. Rayne didn't like to look too closely on how she had gotten her position here at the Metropolitan Police Force. She was determined to prove she deserved that position though. His voice brought her from her thoughts. Anything else of note? No, sir. If Mains ignored the significance of a woman's name on a wedding ring held by a man, she wouldn't mention it. It was rare she was given a case of any significance. She most likely only landed this one because everyone thought it was a prank pulled by some bored children. Mains hummed. We'll keep it open for the moment, but without any name or clue to his identity I doubt there is much you can do to close this case. Good work. Have the collectors taken his body in? Yes, what was left of him, sir. She didn't envy the collectors their work. Though it was a promotion over collecting human waste from the streets. Fine, you can leave now. He didn't even look up from his notes. Rayne sighed as she left. Though she had fought her way to have a place in this organization, she had never managed to be comfortable with her superiors. She was afraid they would see her for what she was. Defective. When she returned to her desk, She scowled down at her flintlock taken out of its case in her desk drawer and laid precisely on her desk. There was also an assortment of polishing cloths precisely placed to the side. Not one of them had been applied to the flintlock, but it was a clear sign Fields thought she had been neglecting her weapon. It wasn't like she carried it. Flintlocks were notorious for their inaccuracy, and if Rayne needed her gun to deal with a situation, she was in a lot more trouble than a single bullet could solve. A glance at Larkin's desk showed Fields had singled her out for the passive-aggressive rebuke. Instead of arguing with her superior, she sat down and started on her neglected weapon. While she was at it, she could go over her hand with the polishing cloth. She had been neglecting that as well, and the buff to get off the blood had only shown how much in need it was of a good clean. Chapter 3. Rayne handed the footman her hat and her single glove. She had tried gloves with her mechanical hand, but the material always caught in the articulated segments and restricted her movement and ruined them. Tired of the reproach from her maid, she had decided it wasn't worth it. Besides, it was a social nicety and she didn't particularly care what society thought of her mechanical hand. Duchess Ancaster, in all her glory, bounced down the stairs. Entirely too energetic for a 50-year-old woman. Perfect, you're home in time to be ready for the Inverness ball. Lady Inverness was a close friend of the family and always made a point to invite Rayne whenever she hosted an event. Her events were always well attended despite inviting a lower-class element, as the high echelons of society saw it. It was likely the only ball Rayne would be invited to for the whole season. Rayne groaned. "Do I have to go?" Her mother waved a scolding hand her way. "You sound juvenile, dear. You'll never entice a young gentleman with that attitude." Not that her mother was delusional, instead saw her for who she really was. Instead of for the deformity that blinded those in society, who focused on what she didn't have instead of who she was inside. No one would see her as desirable. "Mother, you know I won't marry." Rayne waved her mechanical hand indicating the main objection men had to matrimony with her, that no title or money could overcome. "Pfft, any man who is intimidated by a little metal doesn't deserve to be in the family." Her parents had married for compatibility and that suited them well, as it had developed into love. Her mother wanted that for all her children. Unusual in a society that married children off to others to cement deals and to create alliances, all in order to shore up their failing funds. Her own investments already overwhelmed most gentlemen's incomes, so she didn't need anyone to take care of her. "You have other children to torture. Surely you can find one of them to drag with you tonight." Rayne tried to deflect her mother's attention. Shamelessly, Duchess Ancaster admitted, "Oh, I've already dragooned your brother." Talk of her brother brought a look of guilt to her mother's eyes. Rayne reached out, placing her hand on her arm and said, "It wasn't your fault." She knew what her mother thought. It was because of her brother that Rayne had lost her hand. A silly accident, but her mother blamed herself as she had only produced one male heir out of the 7 children she had borne. That meant they had taken extra care with her brother's health, including a reckless carriage ride in the middle of winter to get the family to the doctor because her brother had a fever. Unfortunately, the carriage had skidded on ice and rolled in a ditch. Rayne had lost her hand, and from then on, her future had changed at the ripe old age of 9. "Fine, I'll go tonight." She capitulated as one thing was still true: she loved her mother. Lady Ancaster brightened suspiciously fast. "I'll have the maid put out your gold gown." Rayne groaned. "Not the gold one. It shows too much flesh." "Seriously, Mother, I'm not going tonight to be ogled by men looking for a mistress." Her mother slapped her shoulder. "Never. You're a duke's daughter, no one would insult your father like that. Besides, there is going to be a dragon there tonight and gold is appropriate." The dragons in the Wyvern Empire were all gold. Everyone at the ball tonight would be wearing gold in a hope to attract the attention of the dragon. It was the greatest achievement for a noble woman to marry a dragon. Unfortunately, no dragon lived in Londinium, so the dragon would be in demand. Not gold, Mum. I'll wear that black brocade number I ordered last month. Her mother wrinkled her nose. The gown had gold accents, but the black was more dominant. Rayne had ordered it after a spiteful woman had called her a lover of death. She hadn't had the opportunity to wear it as she avoided society when she could. Or to be more accurate, society avoided her. Her mother gave in too easily. Fine, as long as you come with me to tea at Lady Pembroke's next week. Any hint of the pain before was gone from her mother's eyes. Rayne really shouldn't let her mother manipulate her. Mother, you're a shark. I think I'm bleeding. She put her hand over her heart, imitating a fatal wound. Duchess Ancaster huffed at the play acting. Oh, stop being so dramatic and go get dressed. She flapped a hand to indicate haste was needed. Everett appeared at the top of the stairs. You might as well give in, sis. She only gets worse if you resist. Rayne skipped up the stairs and hugged Everett. He had been away at school for months and she had missed him. He was younger than her, and it was through their games together that she had discovered her love for investigation. Back then it had been finding who had stolen his toy train. He returned the hug a little too tightly. At least he wasn't embarrassed to show affection. There had been a few years there that he had resisted any show of fondness from her or others in the family. His eyes looked sad when she pulled back. She frowned, but he gave the slightest shake of his head so she wouldn't worry. Besides, you have to attend in order to protect me. He shuddered dramatically. He clearly took after their mother. Rayne patted his cheek. You'll have to learn how to keep the mamas away someday. I'll take pity on you this one time. You'll owe me. Sauntering away, she grinned to herself. She wouldn't have much time to ready herself for the ball, but she wasn't going to rush. As she passed the small study on the second floor, she saw her sister, Catherine, curled up with a book absently chewing on an early meal. When Rayne called a greeting, she waved her hand with a slab of roast beef stuffed into some bread, but her eyes never left her book. Rayne tutted at the scholarly bent that would have been beaten out of most women of society but encouraged in their family. When Rayne arrived in her room, the maid was already laying out her black brocade, which indicated her mother had planned all of this. The Inverness ball was a shindig worthy of the name. Carriages lined the street as those who had timed it perfectly were able to alight without an interminable wait. Others had to entertain themselves while they waited. Footmen in red and gold helped them from their carriage when their time arrived to disembark. Duchess Ancaster was a general when it came to timing. They arrived just before the crowds, but still fashionably late. Their own wait had been minutes instead of hours. Everett didn't wait for the footman to help and skipped out of the carriage. He still had the lanky swagger of youth, but he was filling out into a frame that had been too awkward and tall for his teenage self. He probably would need help to keep away marriage-minded mothers after all. They were barely inside when Everett said as he brushed past them, "See you later." Duchess Ancaster huffed, exasperated by her son. That boy. As they watched him socialize with some men who were working on a bridge that would span the Thames in Westminster. The second bridge of its kind. Everett wasn't fascinated by bridges, but he knew he could escape marriage-minded mamas by hiding out with the dreadfully boring men who spoke only of their work. If any braved the scholars, then it was Rayne's job to play interference. Together Rayne and her mother eyed the ballroom. Duchess Ancaster announced, "A very mixed crowd." Rayne snorted softly. "You mean there are people from every level of society? I would never have considered you a snob, Mother." "Not a snob, but I would have worn a different dress. Probably one even more flamboyant than the emerald velvet and lace conflagration." Duchess Ancaster liked to make a splash when she could. She whacked Rayne on her arm with her fan and gestured with it to a space on the other side of the ballroom. "That dragon is here. You're surprised? You were the one who told me he would be here." Across the room stood the dragon. There was not much to discern him from normal men. He wasn't overly tall, but he had striking features. Hair the color of dusty mahogany. It was his eyes that set him apart. They were as golden as 100-year-old whiskey. He was dressed in a red and gold-tailed coat. The fashion was a little out of date, but he was still a dashing figure, as evidenced by the tittering women who stood suspiciously close. The dragon didn't pay them any attention. Instead, he seemed very involved in a conversation with another gentleman. Duchess Ancaster said, "I see Lady Inverness. I'll give her our greetings. Don't go anywhere. I want you to meet the dragon." Rayne couldn't help but comment sarcastically, "Will you obtain an introduction?" It was usual for matrons to introduce new people to each other to maintain propriety. Duchess Ancaster whacked her with the fan again. "For a dragon? You have to be kidding. Dragons hate society and its airs. We'll just go up to him and introduce ourselves."